Hi. In today's video we're going to be talking about framing. Now in this particular case we're going to be framing the subfloor, but framing the subfloor and framing the walls for a tiny house is generally the same thing. So any lessons that you learned today are going to be also applied for the framing of the walls. Now generally in a standard house, the subfloor, when it's framed out, it uses a much sturdier wood, so maybe 2x8s or 2x12s. But for a tiny house, since the metal framing of the trailer gives so much support, we can get away with using a much smaller piece of wood, which is 2x4s. Assuming that you already have a good set of plans, the hard work of framing has already been done for you. The hard work is figuring out all the measurements, finding out where the pieces go, make sure that it's going to support the load. Once you already have that, if you have a set of plans, you already have that. Once you already have that, it just comes down to cutting the lumber to the sizes specified and then fastening it together. Now it's a big job, but it is probably one of the simplest jobs that you're going to do on the build. It's very involved, but it's not very complicated. Now the first step, you're going to have to cut your lumber to size. I usually cut lumber in sections, so I'll do enough lumber so that I can work for a little while, and then I'll come back and cut some more lumber. I don't normally cut it all at once, just in the event that I find a mistake or I need to make an adjustment. It doesn't impact all the lumber that I've already cut. Now to cut the lumber, I'm going to be using an electric miter saw. This is one of the most heavily used tools on your job. There's probably, besides sheathing, there's probably not a single piece of wood that's gonna be put in your house that's not going to be run through this saw. So it's very important. It's very convenient. You don't want to skimp out on this. I've seen people that try to use just a circular saw in place of this, and that's not a good idea. Now these come in all different prices and features. Most of the features are really just convenience, so that so you don't have to, so it'll save you a little bit of time down the road. You'll have to determine for yourself if those conveniences are worth it. A lot of them you won't run into that many times, so it's not that important. But for instance, this one is a 12-inch. This one has a 12-inch blade. You can find some that have a 10-inch blade. The difference is that when you have longer lumber, you won't be able to cut through all of it in one cut. You'll actually have to turn it over and then cut the back side of the wood. You won't run into that much, since we're going to be using mostly 2x4s, so that's not that important, but it does take a little bit extra time. One of the other features is the fact that this one turns both directions. If you're cutting crown molding, for instance, it might be a pain to have to turn your wood every time you want to cut a different angle. That's, once again, you're not going to run into that often building a tiny house, depending on how you want to do the trim work on the inside. So anyways, you'll have to evaluate what you're willing to spend, but it's definitely worth getting something. The other nice thing about this one is it comes with a rack, so it's easy to support your wood as you're cutting longer pieces, and then you can also set up a stop for it. There's a small ledge right here where I can raise it up and stop the wood, so that if I'm cutting a bunch of pieces all the same length, I can just set that up one time, put the lumber in place, cut it. Once again, if you're doing a large framing project, that's really important. But we're talking maybe having 30 or 40 studs the same size, so it's not that big of a job. It's not going to save you that much time. So it's entirely up to you. But at a minimum, you at least need the saw. Don't need all the features. Now that we have our wood cut for a particular section, it's time to fasten it together. The first step is to mark the wood so that we know where all the pieces go. We're going to want to mark the top plate and the kick plate at the same time. That way we ensure that the boards line up. Now this is called speed square, and it happens to be 7 inches long, which is the width of two 2x4s. And this enables you to mark both boards at the same time. Now the convention for marking the wood is you mark a line, you measure it, mark the line, and then you draw an X to indicate which side of the board, which side of the line the board should go. Now this seems like it's obvious when it's right here, but when you span a good distance, it's sometimes not so obvious, and then you'll stand the wall up and you'll see a board is off. Now an X indicates that the board goes from the top all the way to the bottom, but sometimes, like underneath a window, you'll have half of a board, half of a stud. In that case, you'd mark it with a 0. Okay, so let's measure our board and mark it. Once you've got your wood cut, you need to fasten it together. For that, you have two different options. You can either use screws or nails. Screws require the least amount of equipment, as they really only need a drill and then an impact driver. You're definitely going to want to use an impact driver for the types of screws that you're going to have to use for framing, because it's 3.5 inches. If you used a normal screwdriver, what would likely happen is you'd get most of the way in, and then the tip would either break off or you'd strip it out. Now you have to pre-drill the first piece of wood before you drive the screw, because otherwise what will happen is the notches will get caught on the first piece and the second piece, and if the pieces of wood aren't pressed together really tight to begin with, you'll never be able to bind them up. The wood just won't bind because the grooves are catching on both pieces of wood. By pre-drilling the first piece of wood, and the fact that this is a little bit smooth on the upper part of the screw, it won't catch so much on the outside piece of wood. That way when you tighten it up, it can really bind together. Now this requires the least amount of equipment, but it's also the most time consuming, because each piece of wood requires 2 fasteners on each side, and that's to prevent it from spinning. And so you have to pre-drill 2 holes and then drive 2 screws. Whereas a hammer and nails, you could do it much quicker. Now the problem with the hammer and nails is that when you use just a regular hammer, the nail that you usually use for that is called a smooth shank nail. And so it's this long portion of the nail is called the shank. And when that's smooth, the nail can come out a little bit easier. That's really not that big of a concern when you're the way that we're going to be attaching our siding later on, but you still, like to be a little bit more cautious since this trailer is going to be on the road. So to be a little bit more cautious, they make 2 different types of nails that are a little bit more difficult to pull out. This one is called a ring shank, and that's because it has these little rings on it which catch on the wood when it goes in, and it's harder to pull out. It also has a little bit of an adhesive on it, which keeps it in there a little bit better. The other option that I haven't seen for a pneumatic nailer, but they do make it for hammer nails, is a spiral shank nail, and that's where the shank of the nail is actually spinning. So sometimes it's called a screw nail, and those, when you put them in, they're really difficult to pull out. This one works in this gun, so this is what I'm using. This is a big piece of equipment, but surprisingly it's only about $150, so it's not as expensive as you might imagine. It does require an air compressor though, but you'll likely need an air compressor when you go to do the inside work. I've seen air compressors run as low as as low as $60 before, so they're not the best air compressors, but for the price it's hard to beat. Well, I've almost completed construction of the subfloor, but I've left it in 3 different pieces. I've got a back piece, a center piece, and a front piece. And the reason I did that, if I attached them all together, I wouldn't be able to move the subfloor anymore because of the notches of the wheel wells. And I'm going to want to be able to slide this so that I can attach it to the trailer, but we'll see that in the next step.